Steven Universe is a show that's all about love and acceptance, but it's also full of characters who are stuck in patterns that hold them back and hurt the people around them. From Steven's dangerous need to fix everyone, to Garnet's emotional coldness, to Amethyst's refusal to grow up. These flaws shape the whole world of the show in ways nobody wants to admit. In this video, we're going to be talking about one bad thing about every Steven Universe character. But before we start, hit that subscribe button. Steven Universe is way too naive, and his constant need to fix everyone puts people in danger. While fans love Steven for being kind and hopeful, the truth is that his refusal to see the world for what it really is has made situations worse, and put both him and his loved ones in serious danger. He thinks every problem can be solved with hugs and talking, even when dealing with literal war criminals and aliens who want to destroy Earth. The Return shows Steven's dangerous naivete at its worst, when actual threats arrive on Earth. When Jasper, Peridot, and Lapis show up in their warship to destroy the planet, Steven's first thought is to try to make friends with genocidal aliens. Even as the crystal gems are desperately getting ready for battle and evacuating the town, Steven keeps thinking he can somehow talk his way out of this situation. The most telling moment in this episode is when Steven insists on staying to help fight because he really believes his presence will somehow make everything better. He tells the gems, "I'm a crystal gem too," and throws himself in front of a massive energy blast, nearly getting himself killed. His shield saves everyone in that moment, but only by pure luck. Steven had no way of knowing he could summon a shield that big. What makes Steven's behavior so dangerous here is that he's operating on pure wishful thinking. He doesn't have a plan, he doesn't understand the situation, and he doesn't listen to the people who actually know what they're dealing with. The crystal gems try over and over to get him to safety because they understand what this is. A war situation, not a friendship problem, but Steven's naivete makes him think that his good intentions and pure heart will somehow be enough to stop an invasion. The episode ends with Steven being captured by Jasper, who is genuinely confused and disgusted by what she sees as rose quartz hiding in a child's body. Steven's naivete has put him directly in the hands of someone who wants to kill him, and he still doesn't seem to understand how serious the situation is. His refusal to see these aliens as genuine threats has made him a problem for everyone trying to protect him. Alone Together shows how Steven's naivete creates problems even in supposedly safe situations. When Steven and Connie accidentally fuse into Stevani, Steven's immediate reaction is excitement and wonder rather than any thought about what this means or what problems it might cause. He doesn't think about whether they're ready for this, whether it's safe, or what might happen next. Steven's naivete shows most clearly when Stevani goes to the rave and attracts unwanted attention from Kevin. Steven's part of the fusion is completely unprepared for how adults might react to Stevani's appearance and behavior. He's so confused on the fun and wonder of fusion that he doesn't think about that Stevani looks like an attractive teenager and might attract predatory attention. When Kevin starts hitting on Stevani and making them uncomfortable, Steven's naive part of the fusion doesn't know how to handle the situation. He's never had to deal with this kind of adult manipulation before, and his innocent worldview hasn't prepared him for someone who might have bad intentions. Connie has to be the one to recognize that something is wrong and get them out of the situation. The episode shows how Steven's naivety can put him and others others in danger even when he thinks he's just having innocent fun. His inability to see potential problems or recognize when situations are inappropriate creates risks that more experienced people have to help him navigate. His good intentions don't protect him from the consequences of his poor judgment. Mindful education reveals the deeper problems with Steven's naive worldview by showing how it affects his mental health and relationships. Throughout this episode, Steven struggles with guilt over having to fight Bismuth, Jasper, and Eyeball, but his guilt comes from his naive belief that he should have been able to save them all through kindness alone. Steven's hallucinations during fusion training show how his naivety has set him up for psychological trauma. He's convinced himself that violence is never necessary and that every problem can be solved through understanding and compassion. When reality forces him into situations where he has to choose between protecting innocent people and trying to redeem villains, his naive worldview collapses and leaves him unable to cope. The most telling part of this episode is how Steven reacts to his past conflicts. Instead of recognizing that he made the best decisions he could in impossible situations, he tortures himself with guilt because his naive beliefs told him there should have been a peaceful solution to every conflict. His refusal to accept that some people choose to be harmful has left him unprepared for the moral complexity of real-world situations. Steven's breakdown during the fusion shows how his naivete has actually made him weaker, not stronger. His inability to accept that sometimes violence is necessary to protect innocent people has left him psychologically fragile when faced with the consequences of his actions. He's so committed to his naive worldview that he'd rather suffer than acknowledge that the world sometimes requires difficult choices. Steven's dangerous naivete consistently puts the crystal gems in impossible situations throughout the series. They constantly have to choose between protecting Steven and doing what's necessary to keep Earth safe. His naive belief that everyone can be redeemed forces them to take unnecessary risks and spend time and energy on hopeless causes instead of focusing on real threats. In The Return, the gems have to split their attention between fighting off an invasion and keeping Steven safe from his own poor judgment. His insistence on staying in danger means they can't focus entirely on the battle, potentially putting everyone on Earth at risk. His naivete turns him from a potential asset into a problem that actively makes their job harder. Steven's naive approach to conflict resolution also enables genuinely harmful people to continue causing damage. His refusal to accept that some gems are beyond redemption means he keeps trying to help people who are actively working to hurt others. This wastes precious time and resources that could be used to protect innocent people instead. Maybe most dangerously, Steven's naivete teaches bad lessons to other people, especially other children who look up to him. His insistence that kindness and understanding can solve any problem sets people up for disappointment and potential harm when they encounter situations that actually require firm boundaries or decisive action. Steven's naivete also prevents him from developing the emotional and practical skills he needs to handle real-world problems, because he approaches every situation with the same naive optimism. He never learns to read situations accurately, set appropriate boundaries, or recognize when someone is genuinely dangerous. This leaves him constantly unprepared for the complexities of adult life and real conflict. The most infuriating thing about Steven's naivete is how it often makes him ignore or dismiss the wisdom and experience of people who actually know better. In The Return, he ignores the crystal gems' warnings about the danger they're facing. Throughout the series, he consistently acts like his good intentions matter more than other people's expertise and experience. Steven's naive worldview also makes him incredibly self-centered. Even though he thinks he's being selfless, his inconsistence on trying to redeem everyone is about maintaining his own comfortable belief that the world is fundamentally good and that he can fix everything. He's more committed to preserving his naive worldview than he is to actually helping people in practical ways. This self-centeredness shows up in how Steven handles other people's traumas and boundaries. He often pushes people to forgive their abusers or give second chances to people who have hurt them, because it makes Steven feel better about the world. His worldview makes him put his own emotional comfort over other people's safety and healing. This also makes it so Steven has poor judge of character in situations. He consistently fails to recognize red flags, dismiss warning signs, and trust people who have repeatedly proven themselves to be harmful. This puts him and others in danger because he can't accurately assess threats to make informed decisions about who to trust. The sad thing about Steven is that his naivete, which makes him special and good, actually, makes him worse at helping people and protecting the things he cares about. His refusal to see the world clearly means he's constantly surprised by problems he should have seen coming and unprepared for situations that smarter people could handle better. Steven's naivete also stops him from growing up emotional because he refuses to deal with how complicated moral situations really are. He never learns the thinking skills he needs to make good decisions in tough situations. He stays stuck in a childish black and white view of the world that doesn't work when he faces harder challenges. Most seriously, Steven's naivete makes him unreliable when things get dangerous. When real threats show up, people can't count on him to make good decisions because his judgment is clouded by his naive beliefs. The show acts like this is his greatest strength, but it's actually his biggest weakness. Until Steven learns to balance his compassion with realistic thinking and accept that some people choose to be harmful, he'll continue to be a problem for the people he's trying to protect. Steven's naivete puts everyone at risk. Garnet's cold distance leaves them to suffer without support. Garnet. While fans love Garnet for being wise and composed, she's actually emotionally distant when people need her most. Instead of providing comfort and understanding, Garnet treats emotions like problems to solve with logic. Her detached approach is fear of vulnerability that hurts the people around her. When crises hit, Garnet shuts down emotionally, leaving others to handle their trauma alone while also taking care of her. Keeping it together shows Garnet's emotional detachment at its most damaging. When she and Steven discover the Force Gem fusions in the kindergarten, horrific experiments shattered crystal gems were forced together against their will. Garnet's first reaction is complete emotional shutdown. She literally freezes up and stops functioning entirely. What makes this so problematic is that Steven is right there with her, experiencing this trauma too, and Garnet completely abandons him emotionally. Steven is a child who just witnessed something genuinely horrifying, and instead of comforting him or explaining what's happening, Garnet just shuts down. She leaves Steven to defend both of them while she has her breakdown, forcing a kid to be the adult in an incredibly traumatic situation. When Garnet finally does react, it's not to comfort Steven or address his needs. It's to have her own emotional crisis. She starts separating into Ruby and Sapphire, basically having a public meltdown, while Steven is still fighting off the fusion monsters around them. Even in her moment of vulnerability, Garnet is completely self-absorbed and unable to consider how her behavior affects others. The worst part is how she handles the aftermath. Instead of talking to Steven about what they experienced together, processing the trauma, or helping him understand what happened, Garnet just goes back to her usual composed self and acts like everything is fine. She completely ignores Steven's emotional needs and never addresses how terrifying it must have been for him to see her fall apart when he needed her most. Log date 7/15/2 reveals how Garnet's emotional detachment affects her relationships with the other gems, particularly when dealing with Peridot's integration into the group. Throughout Peridot's logs, we see Garnet consistently failing to connect with Peridot on an emotional emotional level, even though Peridot is clearly struggling with major life changes and identity issues. When Peridot is trying to understand Earth culture, making mistakes, and clearly feeling lost and confused, Garnet's responses are always practical rather than empathetic. She corrects Peridot's behavior without addressing the underlying emotional needs that are driving that behavior. When Peridot accidentally pushes Greg off the roof, Garnet focuses on explaining the rules about human fragility rather than helping Peridot understand why her actions matter or how they affect others. Most tellingly, when Peridot tries to understand fusion by attempting to fuse with Garnet, Garnet treats it like a technical exercise rather than an emotional experience. She doesn't help Peridot understand the emotional vulnerability that fusion required, or acknowledge how scary it must be for someone who's never experienced that kind of emotional intimacy. She just goes through the motions when Peridot backs out. Garnet acts like it's no big deal. The episode shows how Garnet's emotional distance makes her ineffective at helping people through difficult transitions. Peridot needed emotional support and understanding as she adapted to a completely new way of life, but Garnet only provided practical guidance. This forced Steven to fill the emotional support role that Garnet should have been providing, putting unfair pressure on a child to do the emotional labor that an adult should handle. The answer shows how Garnet's emotional detachment extends even to sharing her own story and history. When Steven asks about her origins, Garnet is reluctant to open up and only tells the story because her original plan fell through. Even when she does share, she tells it like a history lesson rather than a personal story about her own experiences and feelings. Throughout her retelling of Ruby and Sapphire's first meeting, Garnet maintains emotional distance from her own story. She describes traumatic events, being sentenced to death, fleeing for their lives, having their entire worldview shatter in the same calm, detached tone she uses for everything else. She never acknowledges how painful or scary those experiences were, or how they continue to affect her. What is particularly problematic is how Garnet frames the story's emotional climax. When Steven asks what the answer was, Garnet simply says, love, without any deeper explanation or emotional context. She reduces one of the most important experiences of her existence to a single word, refusing to share the actual emotional complexity of what Ruby and Sapphire went through or how it felt to become Garnet. This emotional withholding robs Steven of the chance to really understand Garnet and connect with her experiences. He's clearly hungry for that deeper connection and understanding, but Garnet's detached storytelling style keeps him at arm's length, even when she's supposedly opening up to him. Garnet's emotional detachment consistently hurts the people around her, especially Steven, who often looks to her for guidance and emotional support. Her inability to provide comfort, understanding, or emotional validation forces other people to either suppress their own emotional needs or find support elsewhere. In keeping it together, Steven has to process horrific trauma, essentially alone, because Garnet is too emotionally shut down to help him. This teaches Steven that emotions are dangerous and that he can't rely on the adults in his life to support him through difficult experiences. It also forces him to take on a caretaker role for Garnet during her breakdown, which is completely inappropriate for a child. Garnet's emotional distance also makes her a poor leader when it comes to team dynamics and morale. She can make strategic decisions and give orders, but she can't provide the emotional support that keeps the team functioning well under stress. This puts extra pressure on Pearl and Amethyst to handle the emotional labor of the group, and often leaves everyone feeling isolated and unsupported. Perhaps most damaging, Garnet's emotional detachment models unhealthy emotional behavior for Steven. She teaches him that the mature way to handle emotions is to suppress them, stay in control, and prioritize logic over feelings. This sets Steven up for serious emotional problems later as he tries to handle increasingly complex situations while suppressing his own emotional needs. Garnet's detachment also prevents her from growing and developing as a character because she refuses to engage with emotions deep. She never learns better ways to handle difficult feelings or support others through emotional challenges. She stays stuck in the same patterns of emotional avoidance, which means she can't become a better friend, leader, or mentor. Her inability to be emotionally present also limits the depth of her relationships. While people respect Garnet and value her practical guidance, they can't form truly close bonds with someone who won't share their inner emotional life or provide emotional support when needed. This keeps Garnet isolated, even within her own team. The most frustrating thing about Garnet's emotional detachment is that it often makes situations worse rather than better. Her refusal to acknowledge or address emotional realities doesn't make them go away. It just reinforces other people to deal with these emotions without support. In keeping it together, her emotional shutdown created a crisis that Steven had to manage, making an already traumatic situation even more difficult. Garnet's detachment also makes her unreliable during emotional emergencies. When people are having breakdowns, processing trauma, or dealing with major life changes, they can't count on Garnet to be emotionally present or supportive. This creates additional stress for everyone else who has to pick up the slack. Perhaps most seriously, Garnet's emotional distance makes her unable to recognize when others are struggling emotionally until they're already in crisis. She misses early warning signs and doesn't provide preventative emotional support that could help people avoid reaching their breaking points. This means problems often escalate unnecessarily because Garnet doesn't intervene early enough. Garnet's emotional walls come from genuine trauma, but they've trapped her in a cycle where she can't grow or heal. By staying fused, Ruby and Sapphire avoid their individual fears while accidentally teaching us, but Amethyst does something just as harmful. She never grows up, forcing others to clean up her mess. But before I tell you about Amethyst, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Subscribe button. Amethyst. Amethyst is the crystal gem who never grew up. While fans love her for being the most fun one, the truth is that Amethyst's constant immaturity and refusal to take responsibility hurts everyone around her. She treats life like a game where nothing matters and serious talks are just boring interruptions. This is childish behavior that stops her from being the person Steven and the other crystal gems need her to be. Tiger Philanthropist perfectly shows how Amethyst's immaturity hurts people who care about her. When she and Steven start wrestling together, it begins as harmless fun, but Amethyst treats their partnership like a toy she can throw away when she gets bored. The moment wrestling stops being instantly fun for her, she just quits without thinking about Steven's feelings at all. Her dramatic exit is pure selfishness disguised as personal growth. Amethyst announces she's over this and walks away, leaving Steven confused and hurt in front of an angry crowd. She doesn't talk to Steven about her feelings first, doesn't try to end things nicely, and doesn't seem to care that wrestling meant something different to him than it did to her. The way she just drops the championship belt and grabs the microphone to make her announcement shows how little she thinks about anyone else's involvement in what they built together. For Steven, wrestling was their special thing, a bond they shared that made him feel closer to Amethyst. When Steven tries to keep wrestling alone as Tiger Philanthropist, giving away money and changing his whole persona, Amethyst stays away and lets him deal with the mess she created. Steven even has to deal with Lars's disappointment about Tiger Millionaire's new direction. But Amethyst doesn't care enough to check in on him or see how he's handling the transition. She only comes back when she realizes Steven is about to give away their championship belts because she suddenly decides their memories matter to her again. Her return speech about how their wrestling times meant everything to her rings hollow when you remember she walked away from those same memories without a second thought just episodes earlier. This shows Amethyst's biggest problem. She wants all the good parts of relationships without any of the hard work. She'll jump into projects and partnerships when they're fun, but the second they need real effort or get complicated, she's ready to run away. On the Run shows where Amethyst's avoidance comes from, but also proves how her immaturity makes everything worse. When Steven suggests they live like homeless kids from his book, Amethyst immediately loves the idea because she's running away from uncomfortable feelings about where she came from. Instead of dealing with her complicated emotions about being made at the kindergarten, Amethyst chooses to escape. She's happy to drag Steven along on her emotional running away trip, encouraging him to leave his home and responsibilities just because she's in a bad mood. The train hopping sequence shows how unprepared Amethyst is for real consequences. When Steven gets hungry and realizes his small bindle couldn't carry enough food, Amethyst has already eaten all her own supplies. She didn't plan ahead or consider that their adventure might involve actual hardships. When Steven gets attacked by a raccoon twice, Amethyst just laughs instead of helping or taking the situation seriously. She's treating Steven's discomfort and fear like entertainment, rather than recognizing that she's put a child in a potentially dangerous situation. When Pearl finds them at the kindergarten and tries to handle things carefully, Amethyst responds by having a complete meltdown. Instead of talking to Pearl like an adult or helping Steven understand what's happening, Amethyst gets violent. She physically attacks Pearl while Steven watches, which traumatizes him and makes an already tough situation much worse. The fight scene is particularly brutal because Amethyst keeps escalating when she could choose to walk away or ask for space to calm down. The worst part is how Amethyst acts like Pearl is the bad guy for not understanding her pain. But Amethyst never tried to tell anyone how she was feeling. She kept her problems secret, let her anger build up, then exploded when it got too much. During the fight, she screams about how she never asked to be made and calls herself a parasite. But these are feelings she's been carrying alone instead of sharing with the people who care about her. Her accusation that Pearl sees her as an embarrassment comes out of nowhere from Pearl's perspective because Amethyst never gave any indication that she was struggling with these thoughts. This is classic kid behavior. Avoiding the hard emotional work until problems become disasters, then blaming everyone else for not reading your mind. Even when Pearl tries to apologize and explain her side, calling Amethyst the one good thing that came out of this mess, Amethyst can barely accept it nicely. She's so stuck thinking of herself as the victim that she can't see Pearl's real attempts to make things better. Steven has to watch this whole emotional mess and even gets physically knocked around during their fight because Amethyst couldn't handle her feelings like a grown-up. Reform shows Amethyst's immaturity in a different but equally annoying way. When she gets poofed by the monster, each time she comes back, she should be a chance to improve herself, but instead Amethyst treats it like a dress-up time instead of using the experience to grow or get better. She acts like it's all a joke. Her first comeback gives her 4 legs instead of arms, which she acts like is no big deal when Garnet worries about her rushing through it. Amethyst gets defensive and dismissive, doing cartwheels and making jokes instead of listening to legitimate concerns. The episode also reveals how Amethyst handles criticism in general. When Steven tries to get her to take a personality quiz, she gives obviously false answers and acts bored when the questions get too personal. She can't even handle a silly online quiz about her insecurities without deflecting and making jokes. This pattern shows up throughout the episode. Anytime someone tries to get her to reflect seriously on herself or her choices, Amethyst shuts down or turns it into a game. The second comeback is even worse. Amethyst deliberately turns herself into a mean copy of Pearl, complete with fake fancy talking and sarcastic comments. This is cruel and childish. While they're supposed to be hunting a dangerous monster, Amethyst is using her comebacks to make fun of Pearl and settle petty arguments. She mimics Pearl's mannerisms in an exaggerated way, makes jokes about organizing rocks by shaping color, and talks about needing everyone's constant approval. It's particularly nasty because it turns Pearl's genuine personality traits into objects of ridicule. When Garnet calls her out for being ridiculous, Amethyst can't handle any criticism, even when it's obviously right and coming from someone who cares. She immediately gets defensive and starts yelling about how Garnet wanted her to be more like Pearl, and now she is. But that completely misses the point of how Garnet was trying to tell her about taking regeneration seriously. The third comeback is the most telling. Amethyst creates a lopsided, unstable form with huge muscles, desperately trying to prove she's strong enough, while completely missing what Garnet was actually worried about. She's so focused on winning the argument and avoiding being vulnerable that she literally hurts herself trying to prove she doesn't need to change. When her bulky arm starts failing during the fight with the monster, she still refuses to let go or ask for help, insisting that Garnet wanted her to be stronger. Only when Steven points out that she doesn't want to think about herself does Amethyst finally stop playing games. The fact that a simple comment from a kid is what finally gets through to her shows how much energy Amethyst puts into avoiding looking at herself honestly. Even then, it takes her 4 hours to regenerate properly, longer than she's ever taken, suggesting that genuine self-reflection is incredibly difficult for her. Amethyst's immaturity is especially bad because Steven looks up to her and gets caught up in the middle of her poor choices. In Tiger Philanthropist, Steven has to clean up the mess when Amethyst abandons their partnership, dealing with disappointed fans and trying to figure out a new wrestling identity on his own. In On the Run, he watches a violent fight between two of his parent figures because Amethyst couldn't handle her emotions like an adult. In Reformed, he has to be the voice of reason while Amethyst plays games during a dangerous situation. Steven shouldn't have to be more emotionally mature than one of his guardians, but Amethyst constantly puts him in that position. She treats him like a friend instead of someone she's supposed to protect and guide. This is an adult giving up her responsibilities and forcing a child to make up for her emotional problems. Amethyst's immaturity also teaches Steven bad ways to cope. When he sees her avoiding problems through jokes and deflections, running away from difficult conversations, and refusing to take responsibility for her choices, he learns that these behaviors are okay. What makes Amethyst's immaturity so frustrating is how little she actually learns from these episodes. In Tiger Philanthropist, she comes back at the end, but only after Steven has already dealt with the consequences of her abandonment. She says sorry for quitting, but doesn't seem to understand why her approach was hurtful or promised to handle future situations better. In On the Run, she accepts Pearl's apology and they hug it out, but there's no sign that Amethyst has learned better ways to handle her emotions or talk about her needs. Reformed ends with Amethyst finally taking regeneration seriously, but only after making everyone else miserable with her games. Her refusal to take emotional complexity seriously means fights get worse than they need to be. Important conversations get avoided until they become disasters, and Steven gets exposed to adult problems without proper help or explanation. Most importantly, Amethyst's refusal to grow up means she can't give Steven the kind of guidance and stability he needs from a parental figure. Instead of being someone he can turn to for wisdom and support, she's often just another problem he has to manage or worry about. Amethyst avoids responsibility by acting like a child, but Pearl is even worse. She hides behind control and turns her trauma into a weapon. Amethyst runs from her problems by pretending nothing matters, but Pearl deals with hers by forcing everyone to matter way too much. Pearl is the crystal gem who desperately needs everything to go according to her plan. While fans often praise her as the responsible one who keeps everyone organized, the truth is that Pearl's obsessive need for control consistently damages her relationships and puts people in danger. She can't trust anyone else to make decisions, can't handle when things don't go perfectly, and treats other people like obstacles to manage or tools to use for her own emotional needs. Mirror Gem shows Pearl's control issues at their most basic level. When she gives Steven the mirror as a teaching tool, she expects it to work exactly as she planned, showing him gem history and educate him properly. But when the mirror doesn't respond to her commands, she immediately dismisses it as broken rather than investigating why it might not be working. Pearl can handle the idea that something might not function according to her expectations, so she just writes it off and moves on. When Steven discovers that the mirror can communicate, Pearl's first instinct is fear that something is happening outside her control. She immediately declares that the mirror should just be following orders and can't accept that it might have its own will or needs. This reveals Pearl's fundamental approach to relationships. She believes things and people should behave predictably according to her understanding of how they're supposed to work. The moment Garnet tries to take the mirror away from Steven, Pearl doesn't step in to mediate or try to understand Steven's emotional attachment to his new friend. Instead, she supports Garnet's decision because it restores order and removes the unpredictable element from the situation. Pearl would rather see Steven lose something important to him than deal with the uncertainty of a mirror that doesn't follow the rules she expects. When Steven accidentally slaps Garnet and runs away with a mirror, Pearl's response is telling. She doesn't go after Steven immediately to comfort him or try to understand why he was so upset. She stays to manage the situation with Garnet and treating Steven's emotional crisis as a secondary concern to maintaining team stability. Even when they do go looking for Steven, Pearl seems more focused on retrieving the mirror than on addressing Steven's feelings about the whole situation. When Steven finally frees Lapis Lazuli from the mirror, Pearl's reaction is pure panic. She immediately summons her weapon and treats Lapis as a threat, even though Steven is clearly trying to protect her. Pearl can't process the idea that the situation might be more complex than she originally understood, or that Steven might have done something genuinely helpful by freeing someone who was trapped. Cry for help reveals the truly manipulative side of Pearl's control issues. When Peridot's signal starts broadcasting again, Pearl sees an opportunity to fuse with Garnet as Sardonyx, and immediately begins plotting how to make it happen repeatedly. Instead of being honest about her desire to fuse, Pearl decides to secretly rebuild the communication hub herself, so they'll have to keep destroying it. This plan requires Pearl to lie to everyone repeatedly. She has to pretend to be surprised when the signal appears, act concerned about Peridot's continued threats, and fake ignorance about how the hub keeps getting repaired. Pearl is so desperate to control when and how she gets to fuse with Garnet that she's willing to deceive her entire team and waste their time on fake missions. The worst part is how Pearl frames her deception. When she's finally caught, she tries to justify her actions by saying she just wanted to share a few more victories with Garnet. She acts like her motivation was innocent and sweet, but that completely ignores the manipulation and lies required to make it happen. Pearl wanted something specific, so she orchestrated an elaborate scheme to get it while making everyone else think they were dealing with a real threat. When Garnet confronts Pearl about the deception, Pearl still tries to control the narrative. She doesn't take full responsibility for her actions. Instead, she tries to minimize them by focusing on her emotions rather than the consequences. She wants Garnet to understand her feelings and forgive her, but she doesn't really acknowledge how her dishonesty affected everyone else or put their mission at risk. Sworn to the Sword shows Pearl's control issues at their most dangerous. When Connie asks to learn sword fighting, Pearl doesn't just teach her basic techniques, she immediately tries to mold Connie into her own image as Rose Quartz's devoted knight.
But I suppose I was only a few thousand years old when I began fighting alongside Rose Quartz.
Pearl can't separate her own experiences from Connie's situation. So she projects all her trauma and obsession onto this young girl. Pearl's training is about recreating the dynamic she had with Rose through Connie and Steven. She tells Connie that she's nothing compared to Steven, that her only value comes from protecting him, and that she should be willing to die for him. This is psychological conditioning designed to turn Connie into Pearl's vision of what a knight should be. The song Do It For Her reveals just how deeply Pearl's control issues have warped her understanding of healthy relationships. She genuinely believes that complete self-sacrifice and devotion are normal and desirable. So she tries to instill these same unhealthy patterns in Connie. Pearl is essentially grooming Connie to have the same obsessive, self-destructive relationship with Steven that she had with Rose. Throughout the training, Pearl dismisses Steven's concerns and discomfort. When he tries to participate or express worry about Connie's safety, Pearl shuts him down and insists that her way is the only correct approach. She can't accept that Steven might have valid input about his own protection, or that Connie might benefit from a more balanced training style. Pearl has decided how things should work, and she won't tolerate any deviation from her plan. The fog training sequence shows Pearl's control issues at their most extreme. She creates an environment where Connie has to fight alone in confusing conditions, while Steven stumbles around helplessly. This is Pearl manufacturing a situation that proves her point about Connie needing to be Steven's sole protector. She's manipulating the training scenario to validate her own beliefs rather than actually preparing Connie for real threats. When Steven and Connie work together to defeat the Hollow Pearls, the real Pearl gets angry that they're not following her prescribed roles. She can't handle that the idea that her training plan might be flawed, or that there might be better approaches to protection and combat. Pearl would rather see them fail according to her methods than succeed using different ones. The moment when Pearl accidentally calls Steven Rose during their argument reveals the true source of her control issues. She's not really training Connie to protect Steven. She's trying to recreate her relationship with Rose Quartz through them. Pearl is so trapped in her past that she can't even see Steven and Connie as their own people with their own needs and capabilities. Pearl's control issues particularly damage her relationship with Steven. In Mirror Gem, her inability to handle unexpected situations means Steven has to deal with complex emotional and magical problems without proper guidance. In Cry for Help, her deception creates trust issues in two of his parental figures. In Sworn to the Sword, her projection of trauma onto Connie puts Steven in the horrible position of watching someone he cares about being trained to sacrifice herself for him. Steven consistently tries to communicate his need and concerns, but Pearl either dismisses them or manipulates situations to override his input. She claims to want to protect and teach him, but she's actually preventing him from developing his own judgment and decision-making skills. Pearl's control issues make her unable to see Steven as a capable person who can participate in his own protection and growth. Pearl's need for control also damages her relationships with the other crystal gems. In Mirror Gem, she supports Garnet's heavy-handed approach rather than advocating for a more understanding response to Steven's attachment. In Cry for Help, she manipulates Garnet's trust and wastes everyone's time with fake emergencies. Her control issues make her unreliable team member who prioritizes her own emotional needs over group effectiveness. What makes Pearl's control issues so frustrating is how little insight she has into her own behavior. In Cry for Help, she seems genuinely surprised that Garnet is angry about the deception, as if her intentions should matter more than her actions. In Sworn to the Sword, she has to be explicitly confronted with the parallel between her relationship with Rose and what she's creating between Connie and Steven before she begins to understand the problem. Pearl's control issues stem from her deep insecurity and trauma around Rose's death. but that doesn't excuse her behavior. She uses her pain as justification for manipulating others and refusing to trust their judgment. Instead of working through her issues in healthy ways, she tries to control external situations to manage her internal emotional state. Her need to control everything ultimately leaves her more isolated than if she learned to trust others and accept that things don't always go according to plan. Pearl controls everyone around her because she's terrified of chaos, but Connie controls nothing around her because she's terrified of herself. Connie Maheswaran constantly doubts herself despite proving her own worth over and over again. While fans often praise her as Steven's brave and loyal protector, the truth is that Connie's fear of not being good enough holds her back and creates problems when quick action is needed most. She's so busy questioning whether she belongs that she often becomes useless when people need her to step up. This is crippling insecurity that puts herself and others in danger. Nightmare Hospital shows Connie's self-doubt issues at their worst. When she finally decides to bring her mother into her secret life with Steven and the gems, she immediately starts panicking about whether she made the right choice. Instead of confidently explaining the situation or taking charge of introducing her mom to this new world, Connie becomes paralyzed by worry about how everything will go wrong. When they run into the cluster mutants in the hospital, Connie's first reaction is to freeze up and doubt whether she should be even there. She's so busy questioning her own abilities that she becomes completely useless when her skills are needed most. Steven and her mother have to handle the dangerous situation while Connie has a breakdown about whether she's worthy of being there. The worst part is how Connie acts like her hesitation is being careful and thoughtful, but she's actually just scared of making mistakes and being judged. When her mother starts asking reasonable questions about the dangerous situations Connie has been putting herself in, Connie doesn't defend her choices or explain her thinking. Instead, she immediately starts doubting everything she's been doing and wondering if she's been fooling herself about her inabilities. Even when Connie finally does take action and helps solve the crisis, she can't enjoy the victory or feel good about what she did. She's immediately back to questioning whether she handled things right and looking for approval from Steven and her mother. This shows that Connie's fear of not being good enough is a basic inability to trust herself or see her own skills. The hospital episode also shows how Connie's insecurity affects her relationships. Her mother spends the whole episode worried about Connie's safety and trying to understand what kind of dangerous world her daughter has been getting involved in. Instead of being able to calm her mother's fears with confidence and proof of her training, Connie's own doubts make her mother's worries seem more reasonable. Connie's insecurity makes other people doubt whether she really can handle the responsibilities she's taken on. Sworn to the Sword shows Connie's self-doubt and fears from a different angle, but the pattern is the same. When Pearl starts training her in sword fighting, Connie immediately decides that she needs to prove herself worthy of Steven's friendship and the gem's acceptance. She doesn't approach the training as learning new skills or personal growth. She treats it as a test she has to pass to earn her place in their world. Throughout her training, Connie pushes herself to dangerous limits because she's terrified of being seen as weak or not good enough. When Pearl tells her that she's nothing compared to Steven, Connie accepts this toxic message because it matches her existing fears about her own worth. A person with healthy confidence would recognize that Pearl's training ideas are messed up, but Connie's self-doubt issues make her vulnerable to this kind of mental manipulation. The song Do It For Him shows how deeply Connie's fear of not being good enough has twisted her understanding of her relationship with Steven. She doesn't want to be his partner or equal. She wants to be his devoted protector who proves her worth through self-sacrifice. This is trying to manage her own insecurities by making herself necessary through extreme devotion. When Steven tries to train alongside her and suggests they work as a team, Connie initially fights against it because teamwork doesn't fit her story of needing to prove herself. She's so focused on showing that she's worthy of Steven's friendship that she can't see how her obsession with proving herself is actually hurting their relationship. Steven wants a partner, but Connie's self-doubt issues make her think she needs to be his bodyguard instead. Even after they resolve the training conflict and Steven convinces her that they should fight together, Connie still struggles with feeling like she deserves to be his equal partner. She agrees to work as a team, but her underlying fear that she's not good enough continues to show up in future situations. Mindful education gives another clear example of how Connie's self-doubt fears create problems. When she and Steven try to master fusion as Stevani, Connie's worries about a completely unrelated incident with a classmate start messing with their inability to stay fused. She can't put aside her personal insecurities enough to focus on what they're doing, which puts both her and Steven at risk during their training. The butterfly incident that triggers Connie's anxiety is telling because it shows how her fear of not being good enough goes beyond her relationship with Steven and the gems. She accidentally hurt a classmate during a moment of panic, and instead of handling it properly at the time, she ran away because she has been carrying guilt and shame about it ever since. Her self-doubt issues make her unable to deal with normal human mistakes in healthy ways. When Connie's anxiety causes Stevani to fall from a dangerous height, it becomes clear how her personal emotional problems can create serious safety issues. Steven has to deal with not only the physical danger, but also Connie's emotional crisis, which splits his attention and makes the situation more dangerous for both of them. Connie's inability to manage her own insecurities becomes Steven's problem to solve, even in life-threatening situations. Dewey Wins shows how Connie's self-doubt issues affect her ability to keep relationships working when things get complicated. After Steven returns from his space adventure, Connie is hurt that he didn't tell her about his dangerous plan beforehand, but instead of directly talking about her feelings or working together through the conflict, Connie shuts down and starts avoiding Steven completely. Her reaction is about the fear that maybe she doesn't matter to him, and as much as she thought she did. Rather than trusting in their friendship and talking about the issue directly, Connie immediately jumps to the conclusion that Steven doesn't value her input or see her as a real partner. Her self-doubt fears turn a manageable situation problems into a long period of silence and avoidance. When Steven tries to reach out and apologize, Connie initially pushes him away because she's still caught up in questioning her own importance to him. She needs lots of reassurance and validation that she can move past the hurt feelings, which puts an unfair emotional burden on Steven. He has to not only apologize for his original mistake, but also manage Connie's insecurities about her overall worth in his life. Connie's self-doubt issues particularly impact Steven, who often has to serve as her emotional support and confidence booster. In Nightmare Hospital, Steven has to encourage her to act when she freezes up during the crisis. In Sworn to the Sword, he has to convince her that she doesn't need to sacrifice herself to prove her worth. In Mindful Education, he has to help her work through her anxiety while also managing his own stress about their dangerous training. This creates an unequal relationship where Steven is constantly responsible for managing Connie's emotional state in addition to dealing with his own problems and responsibilities. As a half-gem with magical powers and family drama, Connie's self-doubt issues mean that Steven can't rely on her for emotional support in the same way she relies on him, because she's always questioning whether she's qualified to help or give advice. Connie's fear of not being good enough also limits her growth as a character, because she's so focused on proving herself worthy rather than simply improving her skills and confidence. She approaches challenges from a place of fear rather than curiosity or excitement. This makes her less likely to take healthy risks or push herself in productive ways. Her self-doubt issues also make her resistant to feedback or helpful criticism, criticism, because she interprets any suggestion for improvement as proof that she's not good enough. When Garnet gives her advice about fusion or Pearl suggests changes to her training, Connie often takes these comments as personal attacks rather than helpful guidance. The most frustrating thing about Connie's self-doubt issues is how disconnected they are from reality. She's consistently shown to be brave, smart, skilled with a sword, quick thinking in crisis, and loyal to her friends. She successfully handles dangerous situations, learns complex magical concepts, and adapts to extraordinary circumstances that would overwhelm most people. But despite all this proof of her skills and value, Connie continues to doubt herself and seek validation from others. Her self-doubt fears seem to immune to evidence that contradicts them, which suggests that they're more about her internal emotional patterns than actual assessment of her abilities. This creates a frustrating viewing experience where the audience can clearly see Connie's strengths and contributions, but she remains trapped in cycles of self-doubt that prevent her from enjoying her successes or building real confidence. Connie's fear of not being good enough affects the group dynamics when someone consistently doubts their own abilities and needs constant reassurance. The group has to spend time and energy managing Connie's insecurities instead of focusing entirely on their missions or enjoying their relationship. Her self-doubt becomes a form of self-sabotage that limits her potential and creates unnecessary drama that everyone else has to deal with. Connie's self-doubt hurts the team, but young Greg struggling with adult responsibility while dating Rose, but instead of learning from these experiences, he carries his immature attitudes into fatherhood. When he babysits Sour Cream, Greg treats it like a fun adventure rather than a serious job involving a child's safety. Greg's decision to take baby Sour Cream to the beach shows his complete lack of understanding about proper child care. While putting sunscreen and sunglasses on the baby shows some awareness of safety, Greg's overall approach treats Sour Cream like a prop in his and Rose's beach fun rather than a child who needs constant watching. When Greg and Rose run off to play in the waves, they're basically abandoning their responsibility to watch the baby so they can have their own fun. The worst moment comes when Greg gets distracted by Rose's philosophical talk about human growth and decides to leave Sour Cream with her while he goes to write down lyrics. This decision shows Greg's real priorities when faced with choosing between his creative interests and his child care responsibilities. Greg picks his music without hesitation. He treats Rose like a built-in babysitter rather than recognizing that she has no experience with human children and might not understand how to keep them safe. When Greg returns to find that Rose has allowed Sour Cream to climb up to the top of a Ferris wheel, his panic shows that he does not understand the danger. But only after the fact, Rose's explanation that she watched Sour Cream climb reveals how poorly Greg explained what watching a child actually means. He assumed Rose would automatically know how to keep a baby safe without giving her any guidance about what childcare actually involved. The Ferris wheel incident perfectly shows how Greg's casual approach to responsibility creates dangerous situations. His decision to trust Rose with Sour Cream without proper instruction nearly results in serious harm to the baby. When Greg has to climb the Ferris wheel to rescue Sour Cream, he's dealing with the consequences of his own failure to take the babysitting job seriously from the beginning. Even after this near disaster, Greg's takeaway seems to be more about his own personal growth. I am a baby than about learning to be more responsible with other people's safety. The episode frames this as Greg learning to grow up, but his approach to raising Steven suggests he never really learned these lessons about the importance of structure, boundaries, and protective oversight. What's particularly telling is how Greg handles the aftermath of the Ferris wheel incident. Instead of having a serious conversation with Rose about child safety or reflecting on how his own negligence created the dangerous situation, Greg just makes a joke about being a baby himself. The pattern of deflecting serious moments with humor rather than engaging with the real lesson shows his fundamental immaturity. The test shows how Greg's overprotective tendencies have shaped Steven's development and created problems for the crystal gems. While Greg doesn't appear directly in this episode, his influence on Steven is clear throughout the story. Steven's desperate need to prove himself and his devastation at learning he failed an easy test reflects the kind of confidence in issues that develop when a child is constantly shielded from failure and challenge. The episode reveals that Steven has been having problems with his healing powers ever since Greg faked an injury, which shows how Greg's well-meaning lies have actually damaged Steven's magical abilities. Greg's decision to pretend to be hurt rather than honestly discussing Steven's powers created confusion and self-doubt that's now interfering with Steven's development as a gem. This pattern of avoiding difficult truths to protect Steven's feelings has clearly backfired. The gem's decision to create a fake test for Steven stems partly from their recognition that he needs another success to rebuild his confidence. This suggests that Steven has been struggling with self-doubt and needs constant validation to feel good about himself. Classic signs of a child who hasn't been allowed to experience real challenges or develop genuine toughness. Greg's protective approach has left Steven fragile and dependent on others' approval rather than building real confidence. When Steven discovers that the test was rigged and overhears that gems discussing how they didn't know what he needs, it becomes clear that Greg's overprotective parenting has left everyone unsure how to help Steven develop properly. The gems are trying to make up for Steven's lack of resilience and confidence, but they're struggling because Steven hasn't been prepared for real challenges through normal childhood experiences. Steven's decision to pretend he didn't know the test was fake shows how much he's learned to manage other people's emotions rather than expressing his own honest feeling. This kind of emotional caretaking behavior often develops in children who've been overprotected and learned that their negative emotions upset the adults around them, instead of being able to honestly express their hurt and anger. Steven feels responsible for keeping everyone else comfortable. Say Uncle demonstrates Greg's conflict avoidance and his tendency to let Steven handle adult problems. Rather than stepping in to provide guidance while the episode is played for comedy, it still reveals Greg's patterns when Steven encounters something he doesn't understand. Greg's absence during the chaotic events with Uncle Grandpa shows how he often leaves Steven to navigate complex situations without parental support. Throughout the episode, Steven has to figure out how to handle the gems' fear and aggression towards Uncle Grandpa without any adult guidance in managing conflict or communicating effect. This reflects a broader pattern in Steven's life where Greg's hands-off approach means Steven often serves as the mediator in adult conflicts rather than being protected from them. The episode also shows Steven's advanced emotional intelligence and conflict resolution skills, which are impressive for a child, but also concerning because they suggest he's been forced to develop these abilities out of necessity. Children who grow up managing adult emotions and conflicts often become skilled at peacekeeping, but miss out on the chance to just be kids who are protected and guided by responsible adults. Greg's overprotective approach particularly impacts Steven's relationship with the crystal gems and his development as a half-gem. Because Greg shields Steven from difficult experiences, Steven enters gem missions and magical situations about the resilience and problem-solving skills he needs to handle genuinely dangerous scenarios. The gems end up having to constantly worry about Steven's emotional state and confidence rather than being able to train him effectively. Steven's healing powers problems after Greg's fake injury shows how Greg's protective lies have real consequences for Steven's magical development. Gem powers seem to be connected to emotional clarity and confidence, but Greg's pattern of deception and overprotection has created confusion and self-doubt that interferes with Steven's ability. Greg's attempt to protect Steven from emotional pain have actually made him less capable of handling the responsibility responsibilities that come with his powers. Greg's overindulgence also shows up in his reluctance to set boundaries or enforce consequences with Steven. He treats Steven more like a friend than a child who needs structure and guidance. While this creates a warm, affectionate relationship, it also means Steven doesn't learn important lessons about responsibility, consequences, and self-discipline that he needs as he grows up. The most frustrating aspect of Greg's overprotectiveness is how it creates more problems than it solves. By constantly shielding Steven from difficulty and disappointment, Greg has made him more vulnerable to emotional distress rather than more resilient. Steven's devastation at failing an easy test shows that he hasn't developed healthy ways of dealing with setbacks because Greg has prevented him from experiencing age-appropriate failures and challenges. Greg's approach also puts unfair pressure on the crystal gems to make up for Steven's lack of emotional resilience. They have to constantly manage Steven's confidence and self-esteem rather than being able to focus on actually training him for the dangerous situations he'll face. This creates additional stress for everyone and makes the team less effective overall. Greg's overprotectiveness comes from genuine love and his own difficult experiences. He clearly adores Steven and wants to give him the happy, carefree childhood that he himself may have lacked. However, good intentions don't change the fact that his approach hurts Steven's development. Children need to experience age-appropriate challenges, failures, and consequences to develop resilience and problem-solving skills. The most damaging long-term effect is that Greg teaches Steven to prioritize other people's comfort over his own authentic feelings. Steven learns to manage everyone else's emotions rather than expressing his own, which sets him up for serious problems as he faces more complex challenges. Real protection means preparing children for difficulties, not shielding them from every possible source of growth. Ultimately, Steven Universe shows that even the most well-meaning characters can cause real harm when they're stuck in their flaws. That's a lesson worth remembering, no matter how magical the world might seem. If you guys enjoyed our video, why not subscribe already? Alright, we'll see you next time. See you later!